Jaguar Land Rover. It's a highly political news story about an iconic British brand.
When you look at an organisation like JLR, the supply chain is so extensive and the pockets of knowledge across the UK are so important, not just for JLR, but potentially for the future success of the UK.
You've got the East Midlands, all these businesses. Across that whole ecosystem, there are going to be a lot of nervous investors, a lot of nervous owners, a lot of nervous creditors.
There are so many incidents happening. The threat landscape is evolving. How do you filter the noise and get to the ones that you have to analyze and assess?
If you look at JLR and even some of the previous attacks of kind of M&S, these are organisations that are spending potentially kind of millions on cybersecurity, but they're still falling victim to cyber attacks.
JLR incident gives an opportunity to add a new lens to cyber risk management.
I think there's a genuine imperative to go out and manage risk appropriately.
Arguably, this is not about cybersecurity at all. This is about cash flow, liquidity, and resilience. My name is Roland Thomas. I'm a director at Thomas Murray. I'm joined by Ed Starkey and Shriji Doshi, who are both directors in Thomas Murray's cyber business. Thank you very much for joining me. We're going to be talking about the JLR crisis and what lessons can be learned from the incident.
Thank you, Rolly.
Thank you. So we've seen recent examples of other attacks against the retail sector, say M&S, Harrods, the cooperative. What makes this attack so different in terms of its impact and the kind of systemic effect that it seems to be having across the UK at the moment, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think if you were to take all the incidents that you've mentioned, at least the high-profile incidents that panned out into significant kind of long-term harm for those businesses, so kind of M&S and Co-op and then kind of JLR as well, on the face of it, they'd look very similar. They are ransomware incidents that are closely linked to the same kind of threat actor group, or at least splinters of those groups. But yeah, you're right, this is very different. This is incredibly different. I think you highlighted some of the points that were early on in your introduction about the regional context of this incident. Shriji, I don't know if you want to talk about it in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, again, you covered it from a Midlands point of view. I think this is one incident where the supply chain is concentrated in a very small region of sorts, if I could call Midlands as a small region. But that's essentially fundamentally different from the other incidents where the customer has been impacted. So from a Midlands entity point of view, my customer is impacted, and because of that, my business is impacted. Traditionally, whenever an incident has happened, it's never from a value chain on the upstream side of it, it is always on the downstream side of things. So that is a bit fundamentally different, and the large concentration of it in just the Midlands.
Yeah, I mean, the Midlands is a manufacturing hub for the UK anyway. So to have something that, as you said, kind of rips the heart out of something that's so fundamental to the success of the region from an economic perspective, but then you get the fallout, you get the people element of these are communities that are being impacted, because it's not just one business that's tied into it's not just one family or one individual within a family that's impacted. You potentially got several individuals within a family that are impacted by different businesses that are all tied up to JLR. It's really different in that perspective.
Does this change the way that small and medium-sized companies should think about cyber risk more generally?
I think it changes the way that the economy and every business should think about cybersecurity risk. As Shriji said earlier on, it's different because it's the removal of upstream demand. That's an area that typically hasn't been covered by cybersecurity. Yes, we talk about reviewing supply chain and managing risk within the supply chain, but often it's the providers of services, not the suppliers of the demand for the business, which completely changes the dynamic.
Indeed. Yeah, so a way to look at it, if you put yourself as one of the SMEs within the Midlands, if you were to assess your own cyber risk, you would look at your own ability to defend and protect against a cyber threat, and also ability to protect and defend against the threat from a supply chain point of view. Now what we are seeing is possibly a need to look at, all right, there is a customer of mine, that customer has a cyber incident, what is the impact on me? at least being a cyber professional, I don't think I've seen us as a consultant or organizations look at it from this context from a risk management point of view.
But why is that so different in this case from then, for example, when the M&S attack happened and suppliers, all of the sort of digitized inventories and all that sort of stuff was shut down, and suppliers didn't know what they were meant to be sending. M&S didn't know, the stock went down, online systems were on. Why is this worse?
Why is this worst? Again, you touched upon it, because it's the digitalization part of it. Everything is about just in time when it comes to manufacturing, and you looking at a just in time more from a point of view of a supply chain that is in one specific region. So all of them are working in that mode of just in time. So it's because of JLR stopping production, they are not able to service that business, which like again, if you just extrapolate this to any other industry and just think, right, my customer is X, what happens when my customer has a cyber incident? I think that is fundamentally different in this case. That is what I don't think I've ever looked at it from that point of view.
It's really interesting. So actually, it's the demand side is the main difference then from actually completely makes sense, is that you've got M&S still trying to keep going, still trying to, deliver goods in the local shop, even if the online shop had shut down. And you had manufacturers still sending them, bananas, most of the number of bananas they were sending them at the same time last year. Yeah, fine. JLR is just shut down.
Yeah.
And so is everyone else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think with M&S as well, a lot of the key suppliers to M&S also had suppliers to kind of other retailers as well. Whereas looking in the manufacturing sector in the UK, West Midlands, it's all for JLR. There's a lot of the success of that region kind of hinges on the success of one organization.
Yeah. So that leads me on to our next question. I mean, going back, we're a financial services firm. Go back to 2008, you had a sense that, there were banks that were too big to fail. They were systemically important. They had to be bailed out by governments in the UK, for example. After 2008, you had it started to drive some best behavior, mostly because of regulation. And you started to see banks having higher capital requirements on their balance sheets, having to basically keep more cash so that there was less of a credit risk, less of a liquidity risk. Will we see the same? Do you think now there will be across kind of what were previously deemed as non-critical sectors from a cyber perspective in the UK, they will be dragged into that key national infrastructure conversation, and actually you'll have higher cyber requirements on?
I would really hope so, but I think what I would still think is there is a lot of discussion that has to take place before it gets to a state on how to regulate it. So I really hope that this event is at least a trigger point to have conversations on what is required to first identify such an event happening, and then ability to assess it, and then ability to manage it, right? So I think it's very interesting because it's something that is unprecedented to a large degree of extent, like we've spoken before. Are there any such scenarios that we could think of? So there are so many things. Hopefully, this triggers discussions, and everyone comes together to collectively arrive at what could be those scenarios, what could be the solutions, and then which paves for regulatory guidance on it.
But let's not forget, we do have regulation in the UK and kind of across Europe for particular sectors that was already touched, the critical national infrastructure, and we've got data protection kind of regulation. But this is fascinating because of the credit risk element. It's the first time really that such an incident has trickled down and impacted all of these kind of smaller organisations, that there needs to be kind of addressed. We've seen Bank of England in particular doing kind of stress modelling on significant IT outages as part of their regulatory oversight. The mechanisms, the basis, the understanding for doing that exists within particularly the more mature sectors and the more mature regulators.
Yeah.
don't think it is definitely an option.
Absolutely. Moving away from, I guess, the national conversation and thinking more on the business side for a moment. I mean, JLR is wholly owned by Tata Motors based in India. They'll be feeling the profound impact of the attack, no matter how well capitalized they are, right? I guess, what are the lessons for other investors in highly digitized, highly specialized industries?
Yeah, I think the first thing really is that cyber risk is not only business risk, it's a multiplying risk that has the potential to impact all kinds of other areas of risk within a business, particularly kind of credit. The other piece really is we know that JLR has changed ownership. There's a massive drive towards kind of digitalization. Well, yeah, the advantages of digitalization have to be weighed up against the potential risks of doing it at a slightly slower pace and putting in place the mechanisms that, okay, we don't know the details yet, but we can assume that something hasn't quite worked as intended. So if they'd done it at a slower rate, would they have been impacted to this extent? I don't know.
And presumably, I mean, there's a huge, in the cyber industry, without getting too technical, there's a big discussion about operational resilience. It's the same thing happening in the financial industry. You're talking about, it's a truism when an attack, it's not if an attack happens, when an attack happens, will you be ready? What will you do? Is the lesson here that actually in this kind of industry, and frankly, most industries that private investors are interested in, highly digitized, almost fully digitized in many of their services, resilience in the context of a big systemic cyber attack is kind of meaningless because the business will shut down.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
Yeah, I think it's fair. What I think it gives, this event gives an opportunity is to expand the context of the risk further. So again, you alluded to the credit risk aspect of it. Now let's just try to break it down one level of how someone could look at it. Now you are a credit risk analyst at a specific bank. What you are most concerned about is the ability of an organization to service that debt to you. Now, never ever before, at least from whatever my experience is, that the ability to service the debt was influenced by a cyber event outside of that organization, right? So does the credit risk analyst know that the entity where the credit has been provided has a client like JLR, and they are impacted because of a JLR incident? And would the implications on the credit risk on the short term part of it, it's again, it's the new lens that someone would have to look at within the credit risk. And if you just extrapolate it further to, then do I have to look at it, all my credit investments? Do I just monitor cyber threat events happening and then correlate it to whether there's an impact on me?
I mean, you've always answered my next question to say, I mean, I was going to say, arguably, this is not about cybersecurity at all.
No.
This is about cash flow, liquidity, and resilience. JLR apparently has the cash reserves, we assume, to continue to service its debt, to continue, if there is any, to continue to service its obligations. Many businesses, we talk about the supply chain, many businesses in the supply chain will not have those cash reserves. Across that whole ecosystem, it's very evocative, particularly you've got the East Midlands, all these businesses. Across that whole ecosystem, there are going to be a lot of nervous investors, a lot of nervous owners, a lot of nervous creditors, to your point. I mean, what are the lessons for that?
The lessons for me, at least from my perspective, would be to really understand where critical risk within a business sits. Yeah. So whether that is risk that is driven by external factors or internal factors, it's something that needs to be understood and analysed. The layer of complexity that Sriji mentioned earlier is something that I think just has to be incorporated into any kind of due diligence that an organization would be looking to undertake before investing in an organization. So let's take, for example, kind of manufacturing. We know this is a highly targeted sector. We know that manufacturing in the UK is largely fragmented, small and medium-sized enterprises, potentially underinvested in cybersecurity, and technology and digitalization is the way that you add value to one of those businesses. So when an organization is going in, potentially investing in a manufacturing organization, careful consideration of how any kind of digitalization has been done within that environment needs to be looked at, because it's potentially the key lever that they're relying on as a way of selling their business that could potentially undermine the ultimate value of the organization.
Yeah. And on the flip side, I mean, you mentioned credit. I mean, there'll be, I don't know, banks in the Midlands have extended credit lines to businesses. Did those credit analysts think about cybersecurity for a moment when they were doing their assessment? I don't know. I mean, to some extent, from conversations we've had, particularly in the private credit area, you start to see, they'll look at operational risk a bit more as part of that. They'll look at cyber risk, but once they've made that decision,
It's I think monitoring, yeah, and that is, I think you kind of led me up straight to what I was thinking about. The learnings is there's a requirement to continuously monitor and assessing, so it's not just one time thing. And how do you most effectively and efficiently do it, because there are so many incidents happening, the threat landscape is evolving so much, so many incidents happening. How do you filter the noise and get to the ones that you have to analyze and assess? That's where it would be a difficult ask, a challenging ask, but with technology, would we be able to kind of put at least some semblance of monitoring that would be effective and efficient?
Yeah, I mean, the other thing is when you look at individuals that are potentially being asked to cover kind of cybersecurity risk from a credit perspective, it's a whole new discipline. It's an area that moves at speeds that most kind of risk areas or risks that are, I guess, influenced by kind of external factors don't move at. So it's a brand new, relatively speaking, it's a brand new field. It moves at speed, it moves at pace. There's so many factors, so many unknowns out there. Is it fair that we're asking individuals without, the cybersecurity pedigree to go and assess, potentially critical risk for a business?
Totally. And I think, look, I said that this, maybe slightly provocatively, this is really about cash flow and liquidity, but I really do believe it, because I think any small, medium-sized business owner with any debt on their balance sheet, the one thing that keeps them up at night is, will I breach covenants? Can I repay? And frankly, those lenders have a responsibility to assess the impact, the potential crippling impact of cyber risk, which as a consequence, could lead to a breach of covenants, could lead to then huge downstream problems for a business.
You've got the other factor to kind of consider as well is, again, the regionalization element, which is, classic concentration risk. So if you've got investors that are extending the lines of credit, are we looking at kind of regional investors that are then kind of being kind of, I guess, disproportionately affected by this incident by virtue of where they are? So, that needs to be kind of captured within their own considerations kind of moving forwards. It can't just be a case of diversifying across industries. It has to be a case of diversifying across kind of industries, sectors, and potentially geography as well, just to make sure that concentration risk is avoided when considering credit risk.
Diversifying across sectors is really interesting, because you can see when you look at any sort of threat intelligence modeling that sure, geography matters. If you're in Britain and there's an announcement, in support of NATO, you might find something gets popped 2 days later. But actually sector really matters as well. You see, government massively targeted, healthcare, medtech massively targeted, manufacturing is right up there. So diversifying away from overexposure to a single industry. And we saw with retail earlier this year, attack after attack against the same sector. So incomplete makes sense. So when you have, plenty of investors, particularly again in private markets, have heavy exposure to very specific industries, arguably they should take lessons or at least observe that kind of threat actor behavior. And, if you're overly exposed to medtech, for example, biotech, medtech, these really exciting growth industries, you should really think about what would happen if a threat actor started going after those companies time after time, and how that would impact your portfolio.
I think you've got an obligation to do it. It's not just a case of it's a nice to have. I think you have to have insight not only into not only the diversification of the investments, but then also the third parties in the supply chain that they're using. I think you've got an obligation to your own investors to make sure that you're managing risk, and we know this is an area of significant risk that is unmanaged. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And so since we're mentioning, I suppose, the investment context of this, intellectual property is a huge part of it, probably less than the JLR, but more in some of those kind of, we were talking about the UK and key UK industries. One of the great wide hopes of UK growth are those industries I mentioned, medtech, biotech, stuff coming out of the universities, those kind of innovation hubs, venture capital money going into that, going out, sometimes being bought out by America. But, you've got some really exciting businesses coming through. The risk of leakage of IP is fundamental to those businesses. If a vulnerability is exploited and they lose the IP that is basically the basis of value in their business, then you'll write that off as an investment, right?
Yeah, and I think there is good learnings from this element, right? So it kind of demonstrates the need to assess cyber risk with more broader context, more wider context. It kind of gives a sort of a steer for even at a private equity level or at a VC level when you're going for investments to consider cyber risk more broadly, more holistically, not just as a cyber, but like you say, as a business risk or a risk that multiplies. So indeed, then you could look at, okay, what happens from an IP leakage point of view. So there is learnings for, I think, like from an overall investment industry on both fronts, on the credit and the private equity side.
And you can monitor for IP leakage, but also it's considering it up front, right? So it's as part of it. We hear, cyber is considered in due diligence maybe in the last days or maybe the last couple of weeks in a private transaction, showing, I suppose, more respect to that risk, bringing it forward in the transaction would make sense, right?
Yeah, I think there are very few examples of where a risk that is so frequently seen impacting organizations is handled so late on in a transaction. Absolutely. It's a risk that we know is more likely to occur by virtue of the threat intelligence data and the kind of incident data that we've got there. So yeah, absolutely. It needs to be brought forward. It needs to be taken seriously and considered for what it is, that kind of multiplying risk.
Okay, I'm going to ask you both some brief quick-fire questions just because we want to focus on the investment industry and maybe lessons for investors that have come out of this attack. Clearly, this is a wholly owned subsidiary of a massive conglomerate, but it could just as easily have been owned by a consortium of private investors. It could be on public markets. So I want to look at that impact. My first question is just generally, why should private equity and private credit investors care about this attack?
Well, I really hope they are already caring about it. But if they are not, I would say that it showcases importance of getting the right level of cyber threat information and making an assessment whether there's an impact on them, either through the investment vehicle, so whether it be credit or the line of or equity. So if they're not doing it already, it kind of stresses the importance of leveraging good cyber threat intelligence in their monitoring of their investments.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at kind of JLR and even some of the previous attacks of kind of M&S, these are organizations that are spending potentially kind of millions on cybersecurity, whether it's transformation projects or kind of one-off whatever. These organizations have invested in cybersecurity, but they're still falling victim to cyber attacks. To fairly common cyber attacks, kind of ransomware. We know this has been around for years. It's not a sudden thing. Yes, the way that an attacker would go about kind of potentially infecting a device evolves, but the actual kind of playbook is largely static. So what do we take from that as potential investors? Well, this is an area that you can't just look on a spreadsheet on a budget and say, well, X amount is being invested. It's in line with best practice, and therefore we're happy with it. analysis needs to take place at a very kind of detailed level in areas that matter, understanding where the value of the business sits, and then being able to give confidence and kind of get some visibility or some insight into how the organization has gone about kind of protecting itself in a pragmatic way.
I suppose part of the problem could be that, if you're a lean private equity firm, you've got very sophisticated ways of looking at particular risks. You're probably quite interventionist in your portfolio, certainly on the growth side, but you probably don't have necessarily much understanding of cyber risk. And it's probably quite easy, given what you said about these massive sophisticated companies still experiencing ransomware attacks. It's probably quite easy to become a bit defeatist or nihilistic about that risk.
Yep.
And so I suppose how would you kind of empower a firm without much knowledge to actually get to grips with that risk, but in a really actionable, positive way?
Yeah. So there are three questions that I kind of find myself asking again and again. The first one is what? What is going to happen? The next one is the so what? So what is the implication on my business? What is the implication on a potential investment of a realistic, a plausible kind of cybersecurity incident occurring? And the last one is probably the most difficult, and it's the now what. So what I would always encourage is for the industry to acknowledge that this is an area of risk, and that specialisms in this area kind of do exist, and there are kind of professionals out there that are willing and kind of more than happy to kind of help them manage this risk. But I would always make sure that, as you said, it's actionable, and that you get those three questions answered at every possible kind of point within a conversation. Being able to translate it into the now what is what makes an advisor from it's what makes a good advisor worth their fee.
I just want to add to what Ed alluded in was that this is no longer a point in time exercise, meaning that you can demonstrate that you have adopted the best practices and give attestation reports to it. But it's not an indication of the risk profile. You have to continuously monitor for it. So it's not a one-time thing, it's an ongoing thing. So that is something that I would add to it. So whenever you're contextualizing what and now what, it has to be based on a continuous basis.
I guess private investors should also be aware kind of whether or not they've got a controlling stake in all of their investments. There's still a collective buying power, and there's an opportunity for a community approach to cyber risk, a bit like certain industries take where they have kind of CISO forums, countries take, the NCSC is brilliant here, but you can do that at a much smaller community level. You can have, if you're buying MDR, for example, across a portfolio, you can massively reduce the price of that with a collectively buying that across a portfolio of 50 companies. So I suppose if you educate yourself as a portfolio manager, then you have an opportunity not to leave your individual portfolio companies on their own to figure it out for themselves, and not just to passively observe what they're doing and report up to your investment committee, but actually to engage with them, use that collective buying power to get cheaper, better solutions, and it really help.
We talk about value a lot in the PE industry. How are we going to add value to this organization? Well, is that the way that PE adds another layer of value to their portfolio companies? Direct value by saying we've managed to negotiate top tier services at a discounted rate. That is adding value to the organization. That is something that is outside the traditional kind of wheelhouse of lots of kind of PE funds, but it's got to be an area that they investigate. That it just doesn't make sense not to, from a risk and financial perspective.
Okay, well, thank you both so much for your time. I'm going to ask you, I think, in a moment for some your concluding thoughts, your main takeaways, specifically thinking about JLR. Have things changed fundamentally now in a way that M&S, being the other big UK attack this year, didn't actually fundamentally change the way things talk about cyber.
It's very hard to summarize those thoughts, but if I could put it bluntly in one or two sentences, I would say that JLR incident gives an opportunity to add a new lens to cyber risk management, and that is something that should be looked on, and hopefully will be looked on going forward, where you are assessing not just your suppliers but your upstream value chain also.
Yeah, I think it repositions or it focuses on the imbalance in negotiating power that a lot of small suppliers could have with a big buyer. I think it has to kind of focus on, or at least as a result of this, communities need to kind of look to identify areas of risk that impact all of them and work collectively together to try and assess and address and manage that risk. What that looks like, I don't know, but it's something that can't be left unaddressed. I think there's a genuine imperative to go out and manage risk appropriately.
We're going to keep monitoring the story. We'll see how it develops. I might ask you guys to come back. But in the meantime, thank you so much, Shruji. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Lovely chatting.